Is One Piece too long? This is a topic that has been ongoing for a very long time now. When you think of One Piece, chances are that you normally think about how both the anime and the manga both have over 1000 chapters and episodes. There are several new-gen anime that came out after One Piece that have just ended, and One Piece is still going strong to this day. Whenever a newcomer to anime looks at One Piece, they tend to stay away from it because of how long the series is. Or you even have anime veterans who have consumed so much anime and they are still afraid to get into One Piece solely because of its length, and they feel that they don't need to invest so much time in this one anime series. So this begs the question, is One Piece actually too long, or does the story of One Piece actually justify its length? So to answer this question, we actually need to look at what does it actually mean for a story to be considered too long. Because when people see how many episodes One Piece has, without actually watching the series for themselves, they immediately jump to that conclusion as a reason to not want to watch the series. Yes, One Piece obviously is a long series, but a series being too long has a different definition. A story that is considered too long means that that particular story has exceeded or gotten past a certain point where the story should have ended. And once that story has gone past that set limit, then it will feel like the author is just milking the series because they could have ended the series in a satisfying way at an earlier point in the story. So let's apply this to One Piece. Should One Piece have ended sooner? And I think the answer to this is no. There is no point in the entire series thus far where One Piece could have ended on a satisfying note. And the big reason is because Oda actually plans well ahead of his story, so he already knows how the series is going to end. He did say once that in his early years of writing One Piece, he already has the ending set in stone, and he knows what the One Piece treasure is. One of One Piece's biggest strengths is how well it foreshadows certain events that come into play hundreds of chapters later down the line, and it makes everything in the world of One Piece feel connected and very alive. After almost every arc, Oda always makes sure to connect that arc with another plot point that he will touch on later on, and it's because of this writing technique that One Piece has become as long as it is right now. Here are some examples. During the Alabasta saga, where the Straw Hats went to different islands before finally reaching Alabasta as their end goal, there were some plot points that were being set up in this one saga. In Drum Island, the main reason why they stopped at that island was because they needed to find a doctor to treat Nami's sickness. Then after Wappo was defeated and Chopper joins the crew as their doctor, we get the introduction of Ace because he was looking for Blackbeard, and this was setting up the fight between Ace and Blackbeard, which was a fight that happened after Enies Lobby hundreds of chapters later, but it was being set up from an arc where the Straw Hats were just looking for a doctor. In Alabasta, the main goal was to end the civil war at the capital and to take down Crocodile. But near the climax, we have the introduction of the poneglyphs and the ancient weapons, which play a massive role in the series later on down the line. At the end of Long Ring Long Land, which was supposed to be a funny and light-hearted arc because of the Davyback fight, we are introduced to Aokiji, who is one of the 3 admirals, and those admirals play a massive role in the series moving forward. And during the Wano Country arc, in between the acts, you would have chapters that would cut to what was happening in the world outside of Wano, and those chapters were being used to set up future events of the story. These chapters set up the whole story about the God Valley incident and the Rocks Pirates, which gets the payoff when we get to Elbaf. And it also set up the plot points about Sabo going to Morijua and seeing the 5 elders, which we learn more about in Egghead. So even though most arcs are quite self-contained stories, Oda would always try to set up or foreshadow future events that will come into play, which makes the readers want to continue reading in anticipation. It's kind of like how in the Marvel movies, they would always place a post-credit scene at the end, which is used to set up future events that may get the payoff years later. And that's why people love watching those post-credit scenes, because it makes the movies feel more connected. That's pretty much what One Piece does in almost every arc. It shows us that Oda has a plan of how he wants his story to go, and it also shows to the reader that there is a clear direction for how the One Piece story is heading. And this type of writing applies to how the characters are being utilized as well. There has been many occasions in the story where we are introduced to a certain character or we get their name being dropped, and we don't get to see that character for hundreds of chapters. Roxy Zebek was first name dropped in the Wano arc by Sengoku, and it's not until Elbaf where we finally get to see what he really looks like and what type of character he was. The 4 Emperors were first talked about by Garp at the end of Enies Lobby, and it's not until the 4 Emperor saga in the post-time skip where we finally learn more about Kaido and Big Mom. Even with the Supernovas who were introduced briefly in Sabaody, we only saw their designs and a little bit of what their Devil Fruit abilities could do, but it's not until the post-time skip where we get to see more of them. And even now, currently, at the time that this video is being recorded, we still don't know much about Urouge, but we do know that Oda has a plan for this character just like everyone else. And you also have characters who first started out as just silhouettes, because maybe Oda hadn't thought about their character design just yet, and then when we see that character, they look completely different from their silhouette. Normally, in other manga series, when we are introduced to a character, we instantly get to see more of them and we learn more about them. But with One Piece, they would introduce a character and we won't actually get any characterization from that certain character until hundreds of chapters later, because Oda has a certain plan for them in the grand story. And you would even have some characters who seem like they wouldn't return in the series after a certain arc finishes, but they will still reappear later on and will still play an important role in the story. This makes the world of One Piece feel more alive when you get to see off-screen characters actually growing as characters over the course of the series. So although this does prolong the story of One Piece as a result, it also means that the story is very well planned out and everything connects well together because of this. This is why when people actually read or watch One Piece and then they finally catch up, you would hear them say that One Piece is not long enough, or that they actually regretted catching up to the story so quickly, because we as fans are so invested in the story and its characters, and we want to see more of them and certain plot points that Oda has set up. The Void Century in particular has been a major plot point in the entire series, and as the series goes, we get more hints at what happened during that time, and this just builds up more anticipation and excitement to when we finally get the full history of the Void Century. This type of excitement wouldn't be as huge if One Piece wasn't a long series, but because more concepts and more clues are being added to the story, it makes the Void Century that much more intriguing. And another positive that comes with One Piece being a long series is that it is supposed to be about the journey. That is what Luffy always wanted ever since he set out to sea. He cares more about the journey rather than reaching the end goal. That is why he stopped Usopp from asking Rayleigh about the existence of the One Piece, because Luffy cares more about the journey. And that is what it is like when you watch One Piece. You're seeing Luffy start out by himself, and we see him recruit more members to his crew, and then just seeing his crew become more infamous, and even just witnessing the growth of these characters for hundreds of episodes from how they first started, is very satisfying to watch. It feels like you are a part of the crew because of how much you are invested in its characters. Just seeing the characters interact with each other like a family in funny scenes, and then when things get serious, they decide to lock in, which is always cool to see. And because we are so invested in them, it makes the emotional moments add so much more weight as a result. One of the most emotional scenes in One Piece is when the Straw Hats had to say goodbye to the Going Merry. Many fans have actually spoken out about how they cried over the ship, because the Going Merry has been with them since before they entered the Grand Line, so even the Going Merry felt like part of the crew, which is why seeing them depart from it was so heartbreaking to see. So because of the emotional investment in his characters, the well planned out plot points with a clear direction and tons of foreshadowing and the expanded world building of One Piece, the length of One Piece is actually one of its greatest strengths. But let's actually look at why people have this opinion that One Piece is too long. And this could stem from the fact that One Piece doesn't fully reinvent itself. Although it is great to watch the Straw Hats and seeing them grow as characters over time, at the same time though, it could also be quite draining for some people to watch a series with over 1000 episodes looking at the same characters. And a lot of arcs in One Piece tend to follow a certain formula when they enter an island. First, the Straw Hats would arrive at the island, then the crew would split up, and then the crew would finally reunite just in time for the final battle against the villains. This type of formula happens in most arcs in One Piece. The main exceptions were in the Summit War saga, because Luffy was by himself from Amazon Lily all the way to Marineford, so it was something new to the reader. So because of this repeated use of this formula, it can be quite tiring for some people, especially for a series with over 1000 episodes. And this could be why people think that One Piece is too long, because they don't want to watch the same thing over and over again. But let's compare this to other long-running series. Notice how, even though JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has more pages than One Piece, no one ever considers JoJo to be too long. That is because it constantly reinvents itself. There are 9 different parts, with each of them having their own cast of characters, and each part is set in different time periods and different countries, so you're constantly getting something new when you watch the series. So JoJo can pretty much go on forever, and people will still be fully invested, because it always manages to reinvent itself. And the same also applies to the Yu-Gi-Oh anime as well. The Yu-Gi-Oh anime manages to reinvent itself, with each series having its own main character, its own cast of characters, and they add a new gimmick to the card game so it will always feel fresh and new. And each sub-series has its own fanbase, even though they are all from the same franchise. And Yu-Gi-Oh in its entirety has more episodes than One Piece does, but people don't really consider Yu-Gi-Oh to be too long. So because One Piece sticks with the same cast of characters for over 1000 episodes, and repeating the same formula whenever they reach an island, it gives people the impression that the series is being milked and is going for way too long. But even though this formula has been repeated many times over, The arcs still offer different stories within them, and they are very important to the overall story despite all of that. So to answer the question, do I think that One Piece is too long? No, personally I don't think that One Piece is too long. I think because of how much of the world and the lore that the series is expanding upon, every arc playing an important role in the overall story, the huge amounts of foreshadowing and well-connected plot points justifies why One Piece has become as long as it is. There isn't a time in this series where the series could just end because there will be so much unresolved plot points that the ending will just feel rushed and unsatisfying. But what do you guys think? Do you think One Piece is too long? Or do you think Oda was just milking the series at this point? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.